is hiring to sustain and elevate the academic and intellectual standing of Wayne State University, but on some occasions like this one, I get to introduce the outstanding senior faculty.
Here, I thought I was being cast as the young aspiring.
We've retained these faculty sort of anchor our departments and attract the young, bright faculty to our universities. So today we have Professor Avis Vidal, who came to us Wayne State University, having served in a distinguished role in other places. She served as a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. She was the founding director of the Community Development Research Center at the New School for Social Research. You know how prestigious that unit is. And she was an associate professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. In fact, she got her MCP and PhD degrees from Harvard in urban planning, and before that, she graduated magna cum laude from the University of Chicago. She is an urban planner specializing in the analysis of alternative approaches to strengthening poor neighborhoods, with a particular focus on community-based development. Her scholarship has played a seminal role in stimulating academic research on the potential of community development corporations to make significant contributions to the well-being of poor neighborhoods and their residents. Her publications in the field include Building Communities, National Study of Urban Community Development Corporations, which is the first national examination of the activities and accomplishments of CDCs, reintegrating disadvantaged communities into the fabric of urban life, the role of community development in housing pulse debate, and can community development reinvent itself? All of these published in the Journal of the American Planning Association. She's a very modest woman, so I would not read her entire CV. So that was just a sample. I want to embarrass her further by telling you what a wonderful, practical friend she has been to the Humanities Center. I mean, lots of people tell me, well, you know, Walter, you do quite well, and this and this, the Humanities Center is this and that, but I never see them, they never volunteer for anything, they never help. But this distinguished scholar has helped the center in enormous ways. For example, in 2004-2005, she's a resident scholar. She did research on theory of change. In 2008, 2007, 2008, and 2008, 2009, she served in our advisory board and was a very, very distinguished person and helped in many capacities. She participated in our fall symposium in 2011 as a moderator for the second session. And she has given so far, this is her 5th Brown Bag talk. She gave one in 2002-2003 on social capital and community development. In 2006-2007, she gave a talk on interactions between race and space, South Africa and Detroit. In 2007-2008, she gave a talk on contemporary approaches to neighborhood revitalization. In 2008-2009, out of the silos, developing healthy communities. And in 2008, she helped us to attract one of the only 2 virtual lectures we had on campus, when John Allen from Cape Cod University gave a talk virtually entitled Desmond Tutu, the rabble-rouser for peace, the authorized biography. So as you see, Professor Vidal has been a very, very good friend of the center. And here again, she is demonstrating that by giving this talk entitled Anchor Institutions as Agents of Neighborhood Revitalization, the Case of Midtown Detroit. So please give her a warm welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Walter. You're a gracious host as always. And I appreciate the fact that so many people made the time to come. I should forewarn you that this is a piece of research that is just getting off the ground. The anchor strategy itself was only announced in 2011, so we have to be modest in our expectations of what's happened so far, and equally modest in your expectations of what it is that I can report as findings, but I think I at least have something, so we'll give it a shot. Anchor strategies have attracted a lot of attention in the planning literature for a number of years, largely around the issue of university engagement in the neighborhoods around them, sometimes in paternalistic ways, sometimes as expansion strategies, but increasingly as models of how to work collaboratively with communities, or at least as collaboratively as one can work given strong power imbalances between universities and residents. The best known example is probably the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia. Judith Roden spoke on campus a few years ago, and her book has gotten a lot of play. And oh, I forgot to say, you should feel free to ask questions as we go along if you would like to do that. Historically, as in the Penn case, people said, well, why do we want to pay attention to anchor institutions and see them as resources? And the traditionally cited reasons are that they have deep roots that mean they are literally anchored. Sometimes that's because that's what they've chosen, and sometimes it's because they didn't think they had any viable alternatives. But either way, the commitment's been made to stay and to try and do something in the neighborhood that will enable the institution and its partners to thrive. Typically, they're major landowners, which means they have investments to protect, as well as having control, often of undeveloped land. They're obviously major employers, and they spend a bunch of money buying all kinds of supplies and equipment. Typically, the anchors are thought to include both universities and medical institutions. So this strategy has, in some circles, come to be called the eds and meds approach to revitalization. And people point to the fact that these are both growth sectors, strong growth sectors in the national economy, and in many disinvested cities, the only growth sectors in the local economy. And typically, having made the decision to say the anchors not only have investments, but they need to make new investments in order to maintain their competitive position and thrive at whatever it is they do. So they do have an interest, a legitimate interest in doing something in the neighborhood. Now, more recently, people have started to speculate that the anchor strategy may not have been as effective as it might be in promoting growth if it were implemented a little differently. I skipped ahead of myself. Our anchors locally, DMC, Henry Ford, and Wayne, collectively are well positioned with respect to these issues, right? They employ about a lot of people. They're always hiring, so if we're trying to bring new people to the neighborhood, you get them when they're moving anyway. Wayne brings about 30,000 students to the area, many of them only on a day basis, but the university has a 10-year history of trying to expand the residential side of the campus. $1.5 billion of operating expenditures is, I believe, a little on the low side. And significantly, all three of the anchors have major investment programs, either already well underway or in the immediate offing. Now, moving forward, hypotheses about how to make more of those kinds of resources include the fact that because these organizations have a far-flung regional network of customers and suppliers, if they decided they wanted to do so, they might have the potential to influence the behavior of others in the network. So an example that people would point to locally is the fact that Cardinal, which is a major national medical supplier, is planning to have a warehouse that it will move from Livonia to the neighborhood on the south side of Grand Boulevard near Henry Ford, on land that was acquired by Henry Ford, and the commitment was made when DMC changed hands that Cardinal, which always has greenfield sites nationally, would move to the central city to be part of this package. So that's kind of an example of what this might look like on the ground. Because eds and meds are very diverse and get into all kinds of new things in terms of research and technology, there's the potential ability to connect with and fuel regional growth clusters that could boost the regional economy. And we tend to think about that as, you know, two industries, eds and meds, but Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School tells us we really ought to be thinking about clusters that cut across industry boundaries. An example of that would be a former assembly technician for an auto supplier who, you know, assembles complicated parts and no longer needed in auto supply, who now does that generating highly sophisticated artificial limbs. So we don't think about that as an intersection, but that's an example of an intersection. Very, very specialized product with a limited local market, but potentially a huge international market, because there simply aren't very many people who do that. And finally, the potential for a distinctive kind of civic leadership and innovation in the public sphere, that because these are powerful institutions, often able to make an investment in an environment where there are not that many other investors lined up, that they may be able to engage in civic leadership in ways that others may view as a little bit too risky. So they can kind of set a new pattern. Note that these are hypotheses. Even the people who've developed them say this is still a virtual concept. Now locally, the anchor strategy comes to Detroit. I'm not going to belabor you with loss of population, industrial decline. I'm going to take that as given. But this effort does have to interact with Detroit Works, targeting residential neighborhoods, Dan Gilbert et al. Making major investments in the downtown, the planning for light rail on Woodward, and then the anchor strategy is embedded locally in the Woodward Corridor Initiative. And the Woodward Corridor Initiative is one of 5 sites for a national effort called, rather unhappily in my view, the Integration Initiative, which is the creation of Living Cities. Living Cities is a quite distinctive national organization formed by and run by, at the board level, major national foundations and financial institutions that have developed a distinctive style of change-making that I hope will make a fascinating paper next year. Now, the Corridor Initiative itself is a complicated initiative, only parts of which have been well articulated. Some parts of the website are pretty well developed, and other portals not so much yet. The typical anchor strategy says the advantage of the anchors is they can buy locally, they can hire locally, and they can get people to come and live to get benefits in the immediate neighborhood. And that is the anchor strategy. But I want also to call your attention, whoops, I thought I would hit the point. There we go. To the fact that there's another pillar, new housing and real estate development, which we'll come back to at the end, because it feeds in a very important way to the Live Midtown part of the anchor strategy. And similarly, the notion that they're seriously concerned about amassing capital, not just grant seeking, but much more aggressive entering of capital markets in order to push this forward. Now, the goal in the initiative is to create streetscapes like this, where you have sidewalks that are clearly intended to be walkable with retail at the ground level to attract traffic and maintain visual interest and promote people feeling safe. Medium density use up top, in this case, lofts. Unfortunately, that structure is now embedded in a streetscape that, when you step back, is substantially less inviting. There's some low density, quality units. The sidewalk's been improved, but I still don't hunger to go and walk there. But that's the goal for the corridor. Importantly, there are some uses, some of them still quite vital uses, that will need a different treatment, clearly. The anchors, very prominent, and there are some very nice structures still available in many parts of the neighborhood to be worked with. The older style of housing, which is what we're focused here, looking at Live Midtown in particular. This one is reasonably good condition, renovated, but it's that style. On the homeowner side, Woodbridge probably is the strongest of the existing neighborhoods in the area, although even in Woodbridge, parts of it are not as good as the council would wish. And even this probably is an upside picture because a lot of those houses don't have something next door. Call your attention particularly here to the Park Sheldon. This was an apartment building converted to condominiums when the real estate boom was upon us. The crash comes, units that can't be sold, they go back into rental status. And I think of those as units in waiting. So we'll come back to them, remember them. Now, in the corridor, the trends, although better than Detroit as a whole, are uninspiring. If you're thinking about creating the so-called Midtown boom. In most settings, a decline in population of 21% would be thought of as a disaster, but here we think that's the good news since the citywide rate was 25%. Housing units did decline in number, but they didn't go down anywhere nearly as quickly as population, so the number of occupied units has gone down and the number of vacant units has gone up over between the two censuses. And most particularly, we note on the housing side, two important facts. One is that the vast majority of the units are rental units. So if we're trying to jumpstart the market, the rental market is where we think the action is most likely to be. That, plus we look around at the foreclosure crisis and get a hint. The other number that's really important too are these. If you rework those in the way a real estate developer would, what you see is that the occupancy rate for rental units is 83%, according to the census. Now, when a real estate developer tries to figure out whether he wants to build a new property, he and his banker are generally looking for cash flow based on a 95% occupancy rate. The gap between 83 and 95 is quite large. So the challenge then is to jumpstart the housing market in a context where, by national standards in the real estate industry, the market has to be considered weak. And there's three elements to that. We focus, oops, sorry. I don't do well with new technology. I'm a bit of a Luddite. So we're focusing mainly on stimulating demand in this weak market. but we will come back briefly at the end to talk about stimulating supply. And we want to note that both of these efforts are ongoing in the context of the anchors having collaboratively among themselves planned at a minimum $1.75 billion worth of new investment over the next 15 to 20 years, which is a lot of walking around money. So the Live Midtown program design had 3 basic elements. You create a program structure, which by the way includes coming up with the money. You figure out a set of incentives to get people to actually make the decision to move. And importantly, in this instance, you define and brand the target area, because the area that I just described to you using the census data does not immediately attract swinging anybody, much less serious real estate investors. The first piece fell into place in 2011 with $200,000 contributions from each of the 3 anchors, matched by grants from the Hudson Weber Foundation, making a pool of about $1.2 million. Program is announced early in 2011. All the money is claimed within 7 months, and aha, it's a success. So the anchors decide that they will go forward, and Hudson Weber is very pleased, and Kresge says, count us in. So now we have a commitment to 4 additional rounds of funding administered mechanically by Midtown Inc., which also is the management entity for the Woodward Corridor initiative. The incentives are available only to employees, and the anchors, differ a little bit in exactly which employees are eligible. Some place, Wayne doesn't make part-time people eligible. Henry Ford makes some of them eligible, but basically it's employees, no students. And by most standards, these are considered fairly generous incentives. Would-be homeowners get a $20,000 forgivable loan, and what that means is that you get $20,000 check at closing, which means you have $20,000 to put towards a cash sale, and that positions a lot of people to do a cash sale in this market. If you stay employed by your employer and living in the unit as your principal residence for 5 years, the loan is forgiven. If you, say, move at the end of year 3, you owe 40% of the money back to the program. So that's the mechanism. On the rental side, you get $2,500 for signing a new lease. Most of the people who signed new leases were paying, and the people who signed new leases were paying an average of $9,600 a year for rent. So that means a subsidy of about 25% on their first year's rent. People who renewed an existing lease got only $1,000, much less was expected of them, and many of them correctly, I think, viewed it as found money. What's not to like? Those folks are getting only about a 10% subsidy given their average rent. And then a very small number of people took advantage of the matching loans to make exterior improvements to homes they already own. The really tricky and interesting part to me is the define and brand piece, which means redefining the physical geography, the target area, and changing what counts, how we count what's vacant. And together, those two things turn out to make a huge amount of difference. The Woodward Corridor Initiative goes all the way to the northern border of downtown, bounded here by the freeway. So this is what people often think of as Midtown. This was historically known as the North End, and this is New Center. Note how far this comes up. Note that New Center, west of the Lodge, does not go south of Grand Boulevard. the Live Midtown target area is quite different. The northern part of the north end is now cut off. South of Mac/Martin Luther King is now out, and this is the portion of the corridor that had the biggest population losses between the two censuses. Importantly, we no longer cut off at Grand Boulevard, but rather extend south along Rosa Parks in this way, and then cut over. And that does three things actually. It includes now the western portion of Wayne's campus. It includes this area, which is where Henry Ford is planning its major campus expansion. And it includes Woodbridge, arguably the strongest market. I have traditionally thought of it as owner-occupied, but there are also a lot of rental units, including single-family homes, for rent in Woodbridge. Yes?
In this reduced area that you're identifying now, I've heard that the rental rates for that area are around 95%. If you go south of Mack Avenue, it brings it.
We'll get there.
Okay.
What you want to note is that this produces a very compact geography that includes all the geography that has strong market potential, that is important to the three anchors, and that is mission consistent. And the mission consistent piece is really important because Virginia Park and the North End are not wealthy neighborhoods. And the Woodward Corridor Initiative is very explicit that revitalization is to be done in a way that provides new advantages for low and moderate income people. Doesn't look gerrymandered, very tight, concentrates whatever investment dollars there are to be gleaned. And having done that, voila, in the intercensal period, the population of the target area grew. So this is a growing area in a sea of decline. And the pre-program rental vacancy rate was, according to Midtown Inc., under this new only count move-in ready units methodology, at that point, 92%, which is still not where you want it, but is way in front of 83. The employee response is terrific. We already noted that year one funds were gobbled up in 7 months. Through mid-year this year, about 375 employees took advantage of one of the incentives. The vast majority of those are renters, which is exactly what you would have expected, since that's the stock that's here to be got. The constraints for buyers, in addition to the fact that most of the stock is rental, is that while there are plenty of vacant structures, as we saw from the census, because there is a time limit from the time you get approved to when you have to go to closing, you don't get the money until you go to closing, and then you have to be ready to move in. Going and getting a unit at the county auction that needs $40,000 worth of rehab before you're ready to move into it is not really one of your options. So it isn't surprising that you get mostly renters, and note that, as we would expect, the majority of those renters are people who are re-upping on an existing lease, but there are a substantial number of people who are moving to the neighborhood for the first time. The buyer side is fairly easy to deal with. There aren't very many of them. I think this piece is quite interesting. When you look at the distribution of sale prices for the units that these folks purchased, upwards of 60% of them sold for $45,000 or less, and the majority of those sold for $20,000 or less. So we meaning I, don't have any information about the exact nature of the sale. So I've kind of fudged on that and called them distressed sales. Some of them would be short sales. You know, I arrange to buy your house for less than you owe the bank, and the bank agrees to that because they'll at least get something. Some of them are people, you know, who lost their job here and now they have a job in Chicago and they have to move, even if it means they have to take a loss. So they say, I'm going to sell to the highest bidder and I don't want to hear any bids lower than X. And then they pick a buyer who they think they can get money out of quickly and get off to their Chicago job. Lots of variations on that theme, but that is the bulk of the sales. The other piece that is very interesting and important from a market stimulus piece is this. If you take the prices that people say they paid and convert that to a price per square foot, because when a developer is making a decision about what to build and whether to build, he's making that calculus in terms of, you know, cost to build per square foot and revenue per square foot. So if you convert that to price per square foot, what you find is that the most expensive transaction on a per square foot basis took place at a price that's still about a third below what it costs to build new space. So that means the gap between what the developer has to spend to put a new building or a substantial rehab on the market and what people, even people who are getting the $20,000 subsidy are willing to pay, is a pretty substantial gap, because even for the highest paying purchaser, that price is still a third below what it would need to be to stimulate demand. And come back to the Park Shelton, that is the largest but not the only example of what I've called units in waiting. If I'm a developer and I'm trying to decide, shall I go get a warehouse and do a new loft rehab, that's a big commitment of money up front. It's at least a couple of years to do it, and the units come on in big chunks. People at the Park Sheraton, as leases come up for renewal, they can say, no, we're sorry, we're not renewing your lease, because we start to see a little bit of demand for condominiums. So they can bring new units to market very flexibly, very quickly, and relatively inexpensively. So I don't think you're going to see anybody, particularly in the Detroit context, want to go building new for sale anything until both of these things change quite a lot. You got to let a lot of this pool dry up and let prices go up. So bottom line on the owner occupancy side, I don't, even with my new glasses, I don't see a lot of stimulus on the horizon. Looks considerably more interesting on the renter side. This was 90% of the participants. The new renters, who got the bigger subsidy, bought more housing than continuing renters. And by more housing, I mean two things. One is that they just bought bigger units. And two, they leased more expensive units. And if you look at the average rent for the new residents and the continuing residents, and look at the difference in the average annual rent, it's not that different from the $1,500 difference in the amount of subsidy that they're getting. So they're using the subsidy to buy nicer, larger units, and they're paying more for them, both in terms of the check they write every month and still on a per square foot basis. Still, to think about the stimulus, we say, okay, how does that compare to the cost of new construction? And the answer is it looks better, but the game's not over. Among new renters, only about 20%, a little under 20%, paid a per square foot rental that is enough to be equal to the cost per square foot of new construction. So that's a bit of an estimate. I'm basing that on what the developers of the Auburn, which just opened up in November on Cass, what they forecast their construction cost was likely to be. And so of the new renters, just a little shy of 20% of them are spending enough per square foot to cover the cost of putting that quality of new space into the market. And note, come back, they're using the subsidy to get up to that quality. If you look at the continuing renters, only about 10% of them are paying rents that high. And there are different ways to look at it. If you want to be conservative in looking at it, you would say, these are the folks who negotiated unsubsidized rents initially. So this is the better estimate of what an unsubsidized renter is actually willing to pay. And so we can't change this market only with subsidized anchor employees. You got to jumpstart the market and get other people in the game. So if these are the people whose behavior has to change, there is still a ways before most developers would want to look at that and say, oh, I'm really encouraged. It is encouraging, but not a home run. Nevertheless, the occupancy rates have gone up. Now, this cannot all be attributed to Live Midtown, because even if all of the renters who were program participants moved into units that were formerly vacant, which we know they didn't because more than half of them were renewing leases, but even if they all were, you still wouldn't have increased the number of occupied units enough to get to this. So there is other stuff going on as well, unsubsidized people who are entering this market. Even with that caveat, I come out saying that this all looks really quite encouraging, and that staying the course for the 5 years seems very promising. You know, if there's another national recession, then there is, but you know, assuming we kind of stay on track nationally, it seems to me this looks encouraging. It looks encouraging in a context. This is the demand side. Now we go to the supply side. Remember that other pillar of the Woodward Corridor Initiative, new housing and real estate development. Any new development coming in, here, downtown, any other comparable market, the developer is going to be making aggressive use of existing public subsidies. I've listed the ones that are the most common, and local governments are going to be aggressive in trying to help private developers gain access to those because they want to encourage investment. So you have both incentivize local governments and incentivize developers to go after those. The next two items, whoops, are much too interesting. That's not right. They're not too interesting. This is where the real action on the supply side comes. In order to qualify for something like New Markets tax credits, you have to have a development budget, a total, here's what it's going to cost, with a minimum amount of what passes as developer equity, because the federal government says, we're not going to be assisting something if you don't have a horse in this race. You've got to have some of your own money on the line. This is critical in putting the private developer in a position to be able to do that. Conventional loans don't count as equity. You know, the new markets people are smart enough to look and say, oh, nope, that's debt. So you look at a private investor loan pool. This, both here in Midtown and downtown, can be wealthy people, maybe developers, maybe not, hard to know. These are private transactions. They say, we're willing to put in some money that's patient money, and it goes in as equity. We understand that eventually we want a return, but we know we have to wait until this market stimulus process works itself through. Foundations can make what are called program-related investments. The IRS says a foundation has to invest its endowment in ways that get a good market rate of return. But there is a proviso that if you as a foundation have an agenda, say it's an urban revitalization agenda, you can take a small fraction of your endowment and pull it out of the stock market or REITs or wherever it is you have it, and put it into a low yield investment that furthers your social mission. So the Ford Foundation, they pioneered this, so I kind of pull them out of the air. They could make a program-related investment to Midtown Inc. as part of the Woodward Corridor Initiative, which Midtown Inc. could then put into a real estate project in a way that looked like what we're now supposed to learn to call soft equity. The Living Cities Integration money has some money of that sort as well. It also has a lot of money from financial institutions like Bank of America and Deutsche Bank, where the commitment is, this is a really weak market. Even if you have a good project in this capital market, you may not be able to go to the market and find a lender willing to take the risk. And so Living Cities has said, our financial companies that are part of our board, our members, are committing to make this pool of money if you can't go and get your capital somewhere else. Very flexible. It's a way of using philanthropic leverage that is pretty new. The second is this notion of a master lease. Think back to the good example that I showed you where the lofts upstairs and the retail on the ground floor. The weak part of that economically is the retail on the ground floor. Think about the campus. Even if the dorms are full, some of the retail slots are still empty. That's the weak link. So our patient private investor loan pool people get together and they say, we will take out a master lease on all the retail space. So they'll go to the people who developed the Auburn and say, draw up the lease, we're going to rent all 11 ground floor retail spaces. And that means that when you, the Roxbury Group, go to the bank, you can show a cash flow statement in which the retail space is producing 100% rents, even if it's empty. And then we have, of course, a contractual arrangement that makes sure you are appropriately motivated to try and go get those spaces rented anyway. But the point is that you reposition the development so that it's much more eligible for market rate financing. And this was done in the Auburn, it's the strategy on the Broderick, and it's a very versatile, replicable approach once somebody had the bright idea. The other thing that has changed post-crash is the way private deal structures are struck. If we were to go back to 2005 and say, what would the broad brush financial structure of a mixed-use building look like? It would be 30% equity, and 70% commercial debt. In the current market, that's turned upside down. So all this soft equity stuff is now 70% of the total development cost, and the commercial debt is only, market rate commercial debt is only 30%. That's a very, very strong market stimulus. It's made possible by both willing investors who are patient and very creative invention of new ways to package, market, and allocate money. And it's in this context, you know, if this is the deal structure that enables the Auburn to be built in a rental market where only 10% of existing renters are paying a rent that yields this cost per square foot or better, that says we have a template, but we're going to have to put it down quite a few more times before we really have a boom. So with that, I will say, you know, for an initiative that's, you know, less than 2 years in, they've got more to show than most initiatives after that time. Remains a work in progress, and the floor is yours. Yes.
Well, that was kind of everybody, guess no. Well, you going first? Okay, well, there's two of us. What kind of population demographics in terms of like income and population density and stuff are necessary to support these kind of areas? I guess that's one question. And the second one is there any possibility, I mean, this is just a small part of the 140 square miles, or whatever it is, of Detroit. Are there other areas in Detroit that are ripe for this kind of development?
No.
Okay, south side.
Well, downtown. I mean, it is,
Yeah,
and
right,
it is
those
happening.
two.
I mean, the Broderick's an example
Yeah.
downtown, the Madison's an example downtown. But in straight residential neighborhoods, it's very hard to attract this kind of capital. I mean, you're not going to get this kind of capital interested in the stretch of Livernois next to my neighborhood. It's not going to happen. Those parts of the city, even those with promise, are going to need a different packaging of resources. The target population for most of these initiatives is, you know, the up and coming young professionals, 25 to 35. $25,000 to $75,000 of income. I have not been given the demographic information that's available about program participants, and so I have to go knock again at that door. I know they have it, but I don't. And so the answer is I can't tell you.
Yeah, can you sort of give us some idea of how dense that area has to be? Like, do you have to 600 households per square mile, or
In order to accomplish what?
in order to make the area grow, I guess, or survive even the Midtown area? Because obviously you got to have enough population, I would think, either transient or residential,
Yeah, I
to
don't
allow
know.
these businesses to survive.
Right, and I'm not sure myself whether that hinges on density. You need contiguous development, but whether it all has to be the 4 or 5 story example that I put up on the screen, I'm not clear. I think the neighborhood probably doesn't support that throughout, and you'd have to be looking at a variety of venues, townhomes and you know, lower rise, more garden apartment kinds of formats, because you want to cater to lots of different types of buyers and multiple price points. So I think the issue is less density for the whole footprint than it is getting chunks of places where you create a node of activity from which you can expand. That would be my guess.
Have you got do you have boundaries on the area you're talking about?
I'm sorry?
Do you have boundaries? Do you
I
have?
put the map up earlier, yes.
Oh, okay, I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Could you, if it's possible?
That's it. Maybe?
It's pretty exciting that this is even happening here in Detroit. And I just have to think about, in terms of education, for these people who are going to be here roughly to age 35, that's who you're attracting. And I'm just wondering if there's going to be a second arm about public education or private education in the area.
Midtown, I mean, the Woodward Corridor Initiative, one of its 8 pillars is education. That includes everything from pre-K through college, and I'm a little vague on whether it has a retraining component as well, but it's really not yet well developed, and the extent to which that focuses on public education as opposed to other types, I don't know if they know, but I know I haven't a clue. And that is one of the hardest pieces. I mean, you roll out Live Midtown first because it's one of the most straightforward things to accomplish, and it's something where you could do what is the obvious long-term objective, which is to say, let's score some wins, manage that message, get people enthusiastic, generate some positive spin, and then build from that. And if you're in that mindset, public education is not where you start.
Well, and if people are committed to an area too, that evolves in time.
And all I can say that is helpful on that is that very few renters and a minority of the owners say that they have more than 2 people in their household. Yes, sir.
I guess I have a concern, and you addressed it a little bit in your talk, but I've always been concerned about this tendency to bring middle and upper middle income people into a distressed area, gentrify it, and the poor people get pushed out and get further and further out to the periphery. And I kind of wonder about that in this respect, because you said your model was to benefit the lower income, but you said your target population was people making $75,000.
That's the top. The bottom is 25,000.
Yeah, okay, but I'm just thinking of that, well, all right, that's good economically for developing, the area. But what does it do to the poor people? They get pushed out further and further out to the hinterland, so to speak.
I understand that that's a fear, but the evidence that actually happens to any extent in this market, it isn't really there. I mean, the only example that I can see in the contemporary period is, if you look, I mean, in this area where Henry Ford wants to expand, they have bought up quite a lot of property over a period of a number of years, and that has included some occupied parcels that they needed in order to create, buildable sites. They say they have paid all of those people at least market value, and none of these homes were taken. I mean, they were all market transactions. There are people in the community who are very skeptical of those claims because they are not trusting of Henry Ford. And frankly, in this market value ain't what it used to be. But we do know that all of those people took those deals, that Henry Ford helped them to find other places, and that many of them did not stay in this area. Some of them just didn't want it. They were happy to, you know, escape and go live with their grandchildren or whatever. But the ones who wanted to stay often did not because they couldn't find something of suitable size and quality. It does not appear to be that they couldn't buy something.
Yeah, I get
But we're talking, you know, tiny, tiny numbers because most of that area was very seriously emptied out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think about this in terms of like alleviating, I mean, if there's a homeless population already, both in the suburbs and the city, and if the idea is to gentrify an area, this is how I'm seeing it in this way, and though it's attracting upper income people, but the lower people in the lower economic, you know, get pushed out to the margins, and then the homeless population just winds up getting increased because, you know, in joblessness and all this other stuff in this area. So I realize you're trying to prevent that by creating a bunch of other incentives and trying to, you know, work with the whole distress problem. But I keep wondering about that as a problem because, I mean, with so much homelessness, I just see that.
This is not a homelessness program. There's nothing in it that does that.
Yeah.
The one thing I can say that may be of some solace to you is to come back to this and note that the target area for the initiative cuts off here. And many of the facilities and services for homeless, marginally housed populations are in this area. So near term, the currently homeless people and the services that are available for them in this geography have essentially been excluded because the market potential from the live Midtown, let's build it up perspective, it isn't here. And so their notion is we're going to start where there's the most hope that we can accomplish something, and if we get to that problem, we will pat ourselves on the back and figure out, you know, what Plan B needs to be. But there is quite a lot of opportunity for new construction here in neighborhoods. And we know that in this portion where Henry Ford wants to develop, there is a commitment on the part of Henry Ford to provide housing at a lot of different price points because they have some employees who make pretty low salaries. And so they're committed to having some housing there that is price affordable for people at the low end of their salary distribution. Now, what the sequencing is, you know, it remains to be seen, but that is part of the big picture game plan. Yes?
Yes, I'd like to add and then ask a question. With this man's concern, I'm concerned also that somebody has decided that eds and meds are the best industries to anchor future development in the cities. And if you add to it, we can call them feds and dreads, meaning the criminal justice system and the prison industry. You've just listed all the out-of-control inflationary industries in this country that are almost impressed upon people in our modern economy as real jobs go away, manufacturing or crafts or things like that. And I just wonder in the planning phase, is there any thought given to, you know, the larger picture of where we're headed as a people and a society and the industries we should even support?
I can't speak for living cities. That's not going to be the issue anywhere in Detroit. If you're starting from below the bottom of the barrel, you start with what you have. And this is what we have, and that rolls itself out in many, many places. Now, I think the inflationary issue that you point to suggests that the growth trajectory that gives people optimism about eds and meds, if you think about it, it's been doing like this, and then it went like this, and now it's started to do like this, and there may be lots of pressure from all sorts of sectors for that to level off. Look around at budget cuts. My department has 0 administrative staff. So there are going to be cuts. And that's just the beginning in my imagination. But the notion of where should we be going as a country is not really an issue that can be thought about sensibly when you're looking at an initiative that's trying to fix a neighborhood. You have to join that conversation at a different scale. And I think there are plenty of people who are thinking about other industries. I mean, there's lots of conversation in Michigan and nationally about green industries, about bringing back smart high-end manufacturing. It's not that those conversations aren't going on, although you may not think that they are as aggressive and thoughtful as they might be. But I don't think that those are helpful neighborhood revitalization strategies for this neighborhood. I think this neighborhood's best bet is to build from its strengths. I think that, and it's perfectly clear that that's where the funders have decided to put their money.
A necessary evil.
Well, I don't think they think it's a necessary evil. I think that the hypotheses that I put up about anchor strategies I think those are actually quite lofty, optimistic goals. So I mean, I think if you go to the Living Cities website and look at what they call the principles for the integration initiative, one of the principles is what they call the one table approach. That is, all the major stakeholders, all the sectors have to be at one table crafting solutions. And one of...
I'm guessing all these stakeholders have a lot of money.
Some of them do. But the point is that they explicitly say the reason that we as the funder insist they all have to be at the table is that their attitudes, behaviors, and policies are part of the problem. And if they don't fix it, nobody else can. That seems to me to be, there aren't a lot of funders who say that. And so they are at least trying to foster a different sort of conversation. And I don't think anybody has any illusions that that's going to be easy, but you know, I give them points for trying.
Is there any effort within this approach, this purview, that addresses some of the perceptual problems that exist here? For instance, the ongoing corruption in city government, or the strong racial, racist divisions in the community that are maybe countering. You're offering financial incentives and good reasons to move here, but there are all these other perceptual problems that still exist. So is that part of this effort too, to approach those in some way?
My guess is yes, but if you want to know, is that written down, the answer is no. The city is obliged to be at the table for a lot of these things. So I haven't talked at all about the buy local, which is now about to be relabeled Strive or something. But it's basically, you need to procure a certain target amount of whatever it is you buy within the region. And the city of Detroit does have a staff person who is listed as one of the people who's engaged in implementing that. Now, the broader sort of political culture is something that my guess is it can't be dealt with in the near term. I think you have to somehow you have to stop the financial bleeding for anybody to focus on that who's in city government. But the Woodward Corridor Initiative has a lot of very serious partners, and none of them are unaware of those problems, both actual and perceived. Exactly what their view is on what their contribution is, I'm not sure. Other than by demonstrating that it's still possible in the city to do business a different way, which is not unuseful, not enough, but not unuseful. Okay?
Avis, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the double layer of subsidy that honestly I hadn't thought about. I mean, as excited as I get when I see projects like the Auburn going up, I certainly know that they have big gaps that get filled by tax credits, by direct grants, by subsidized loans from any number of funders. I hadn't thought about then the extra layer of subsidy that comes in on top of it from places like Wayne State for the Live Midtown program. So if Live Midtown renters, if only 30% of them are actually renting at market rate, if you layer that on top of the subsidies that are coming in underneath for those market rate developments, how big is that gap really? I mean, how far are we really from having renters who will pay actual market rate for new?
Well, I want to distinguish two different understandings of market rate rents. The cost to move into a brand new, well-constructed structure with some very nice amenities is not the market rate. That's the cost of moving in at the top of the market. The market rate is the average rate in the neighborhood for unassisted housing, and that's well below the new construction cost, and that's true in pretty much every market. So the issue is getting the average market rate up, and that's why the stimulate demand piece is so important, because if you don't bring substantial numbers of new people into that market, you're not going to get an upward pressure on prices. And I don't, on the price side, just go to John Q. Landlord and say, rents, I don't have a good way to track that. I'm guessing Live Midtown is trying to keep track of that through their members, but I don't know that for sure. All I really have is occasional complaints from students who say that the landlord increased my rent $35, and it's probably the university's fault. Maybe. But I'm not willing to write an article on that yet.
Just one more question?
I just have a question about the impact on the Central Woodward North End, that upper right corner of the map. I'm just curious if there are anybody who are getting in the 50 to 75,000 a year income you were talking about buying houses in that area, or if they found that 50 to 75 are buying in Woodbridge and 25 to 50 are buying here, and if there's a...
Remember, I don't have information on the incomes, and I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the behavior of buyers because it's such a small number. But I am under the impression that there are very few buyers who bought in that area.
In the North End?
Yes.
But there's more housing available on that part, probably.
More than what?
More than the few houses in Woodbridge that are on the market that don't need any work done to them.
But there's not that many of those in the North End.
North End either?
Either.
Okay.
The southern part of the north end does have quite a lot of vacant land, and some of that land is previously industrial land that is, nobody's gonna wanna bring into housing uses, you know, right away. Some of the Living Cities money did go to Vanguard CDC, which serves that area, and they, in collaboration with others getting money from LISC, have developed a plan for the neighborhood that they serve, but I'm not aware that they've actually started spending that money yet, and I don't know what their near-term priorities are.
I do know Vanguard is expanding, and they're doing a lot more programming than they were even 6 months ago, and that they are doing what needs to be done to move things forward up there.
But I mean, they have people who are supposed to help them do it, but it's one thing to get a new person to pay attention to real estate development, and it's another thing to get to the point that you actually have somebody that is, quote, shovel ready.
Okay.